Recorded Books Incorporated presents an unabridged recording of The Black Monk and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov, narrated by George Guidall. This recording is copyrighted 1993 by Recorded Books Incorporated. Anton Pavlovich Chekhov was born in Taganrog in southern Russia in 1860. He studied medicine at the University of Moscow and got his degree in 1884, but practiced very little. As a young man, he wrote hundreds of enormously popular comic sketches for the humorous newspapers. His success gave him the opportunity to devote his time to writing. By the late 1880s, his style had matured, and he began to produce the short stories and plays which are to this day considered among the most distinguished examples of the form, vividly portraying the realities and frustrations of Russian life. The stories in this collection are among his most famous, and were originally published from 1894 through 1899. And now, the first story, The Black Monk.
Chapter 1. Nerves. Andrey Vasilyevich Kovrin, Master of Arts, was overworked and nervous. He was not being treated, but one day, while sitting with a doctor at wine, he happened casually to speak about his health. The physician advised him to pass the spring and summer in the country. Opportunely, he received then a long letter from Tanya inviting him to visit Borisovka. He decided that he really required a change. It was April. He went to his family estate of Kovrinka for 3 weeks. Then, the roads being clear, he started on wheels to see his former guardian and tutor, Pesotsky, the great horticulturist. From Kovrinka to Borisovka, where the Pesotskys lived, it was only 70 versts, and it was a pleasure to take the drive. Igor Semyonich Pesotsky's house was huge, with columns and lions, but the plaster was cracking. The old park, severe and gloomy, laid out in the English style, extended for nearly a verst from the house to the river, and finished in abruptly precipitous clayey banks on which there grew old pines with bare roots that looked like shaggy paws. Down below the water glittered unsociably, and snipe flitted along its surface with plaintive cries. When there you always had the feeling that you must sit down and write a ballad. However, near the house, in the courtyard and in the fruit orchard, which together with the nurseries covered about 30 acres, it was gay and cheerful even in bad weather. Such wonderful roses, lilies and camellias, such tulips of all imaginable hues, beginning with brilliant white and finishing with tints as black as soot, such a wealth of flowers as Pesotsky possessed, Kovrin had never seen in any other place. It was only the beginning of spring, and the real luxuriance of the flower beds was still hidden in the hothouses. But even those which blossomed in the borders along the walks and here and there on the flower beds were sufficient to make you feel, when you passed through the garden, that you were in the kingdom of delicate tints, especially in the early morning, when a dewdrop glistened brightly on each petal. The decorative part of the garden, which Pesotsky called contemptuously a mere trifle, had greatly impressed Kovrin in his childhood. What wonderful whimsicalities were to be found there! What far-fetched monstrosities and mockeries of nature! There were espaliers of fruit trees, pear trees that had the form of pyramidal poplars, oaks and limes shaped like balls, an umbrella made of an apple tree, arches, monograms, candelabra, and even 1862, formed by a plum tree. This date denoted the year when Pesotsky first began to occupy himself with horticulture. There you also found pretty, graceful trees with straight, strong stems like palms, and only when you examined them closely you saw that they were gooseberries and currants. But what chiefly made the garden pay and produced an animated appearance was the constant movement in it. From early morning till evening, people with wheelbarrows, shovels, and watering pots swarmed like ants round the trees, bushes, avenues, and flower-beds. Kovrin arrived at the Pesotskys in the evening at past 9 o'clock. He found Tanya and her father in a very anxious mood. The clear starlit sky and the falling thermometer foretold a morning frost. The head gardener, Ivan Karlitch, had gone to town, and there was nobody who could be relied on. During supper nothing but morning frost was talked of, and they settled that Tanya was not to go to bed, but walk through the gardens and see if all was in order after midnight, and that her father would get up at 3, or probably earlier. Kovrin sat up with Tanya, and after midnight he went with her into the orchard. It was very cold. In the yard there was a strong smell of burning. In the large orchard, which was called the commercial orchard, and brought Igor Semyonitch a clear yearly profit of several thousand roubles, a thick, black, biting smoke spread along the earth, and by enveloping the trees saved those thousands from the frost. The trees were planted here in regular rows like the squares of a chessboard, and they looked like ranks of soldiers. This strictly pedantical regularity, together with the exact size and similarity of the stems and crowns of the trees, made the picture monotonous and dull. Kovrin and Tanya passed along the rows, where bonfires of manure, straw, and all sorts of refuse were smouldering, and occasionally they met workmen, who were wandering about in the smoke like shadows. Only plums, cherries, and some sorts of apple trees were in full blossom, but the whole orchard was smothered in smoke, and it was only when they reached the nurseries that Kovrin could draw a long breath. "From my childhood the smoke here has made me sneeze," he said, shrugging his shoulders. "But I still do not understand how this smoke can protect the trees from frost." "The smoke takes the place of clouds when they are absent," Tanya answered. "Why are clouds necessary?" "In dull and cloudy weather there is never night frost." "Really?" He laughed and took her hand. Her broad, serious, cold face, with its finely marked black eyebrows, the high turned-up collar of her coat, which prevented her from moving her head with ease, her whole thin, svelte figure, with skirts well tucked up to protect them from the dew, affected him. "Good Lord, she's already grown up," he said. "When I last drove away from here 5 years ago, you were still quite a child. You were a thin, long-legged, bare-headed girl in short petticoats, and I teased you, and called you the heron. What time does." "Yes, 5 years," Tanya sighed. "Much water has flowed away since then." "Tell me, Andryusha, quite candidly," she said rapidly, looking into his face, "have we become strangers to you? But why should I ask? You're a man. You are now living your own interesting life. You are great. Estrangement is so natural. But, however it may be, Andryusha, I want you to consider us as your own people. We have that right." "Of course you have, Tanya." "Honor bright?" "Yes, honor bright." "You were surprised today to see we had so many of your portraits. You know my father adores you. Sometimes I think that he loves you more than he does me. He is proud of you. You are a scholar, an extraordinary man. You have made a brilliant career, and he is convinced that you have become all that because he brought you up. I do not prevent him from thinking this. Let him." The day began to break. This was chiefly to be noticed by the distinctness with which the clouds of smoke were perceptible in the air, and the bark of the trees became visible. Nightingales were singing, and the cry of the quail was borne from the fields. "It's time to go to bed now," Tanya said. "How cold it is." She took his arm. "Thank you, Andrusha, for coming. We have but few acquaintances here, and they are not interesting. We have nothing but the garden, the garden, the garden, nothing but that. Standard, half-standard," she laughed. "Pippins, rennets, codlins, grafting, budding, all our life has gone into the garden. I never dream of anything but apples and pears. Of course, all this is good and useful, but sometimes I wish for something else for variety. I remember when you used to come for the holidays, or simply on a visit, the house seemed to grow fresher and lighter. It was as if the covers had been taken off the lustres in the chairs. I was a child then, still I understood." She talked for a long time, and with great feeling. Suddenly the idea entered his head that in the course of the summer he might become attached to this little, weak, loquacious creature. He might be carried away and fall in love. In their position it was so possible and so natural. This thought amused and moved him. He bent over her charming, troubled face and began to sing in a low voice, "Onyegin, I'll not hide from you. I love Tatyana madly." When they reached the house, Igor Semyonitch was already up. Kovrin did not want to sleep. He began to talk with the old man, and he returned with him to the garden. Igor Semyonitch was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a large stomach. He suffered from breathlessness, but he always walked so fast that it was difficult to keep up with him. He always had an extremely worried look, and he was always hurrying somewhere with an expression that seemed to say if he were too late by 1 minute even, all would be lost. "Here's a strange thing, my dear fellow," he said, stopping to take breath. "It's freezing on the ground, as you see. But if you raise the thermometer on a stick about 14 feet above earth, it's warm there. Why is it?" "I really don't know," Kovrin said, laughing. Of course, one can't know everything. However vast a man's understanding may be, it can't comprehend everything. You've chiefly gone in for philosophy?" "Yes, I lecture on psychology, but I study philosophy in general." "And it does not bore you?" "On the contrary, it's my very existence." "Well, may God prosper your work," Igor Semyonitch exclaimed, and he stroked his grey whiskers reflectively. "God prosper you. I'm very glad for you. Very glad indeed, my boy." Suddenly he seemed to listen. An expression of anger passed over his face, and he ran off to one side and was soon lost to sight among the trees in the clouds of smoke. "Who has tethered a horse to an apple-tree?" His despairing, heart-rending cry could be heard. "What villain and scoundrel has dared to tie a horse to an apple-tree? Good God, they have dirtied, spoiled, damaged, ruined it. The orchard is lost. The orchard is destroyed. My God!" When he returned to Kovrin, he looked worn out and insulted. "What can you do with this accursed people?" he said in a plaintive voice, clasping his hands. "Stepka was carting manure during the night, and has tied his horse to an apple-tree. The villain tied the reins so tight round it that the bark has been rubbed in 3 places. What do you think of that? I spoke to him, and he only stood open-mouthed, blinking his eyes. He ought to be hanged." When he was somewhat calmer, he embraced Kovrin and kissed him on the cheek. "Well, God help you, he mumbled. "I'm very glad you've come. Delighted beyond words. Thank you." Then he went round the whole garden at the same rapid pace and with the same troubled expression, and showed his former ward all the hothouses, conservatories, and fruit sheds, also his 2 apiaries, which he called the wonder of the century. While they were walking round, the sun rose and shed its brilliant rays over the garden. It became warm. Foreseeing a bright, joyous, and long day, Kovrin remembered it was only the beginning of May, and that the whole summer lay before them, also bright, joyous, and long. And suddenly a gladsome, youthful feeling was aroused in his breast, like he used to have when running about that garden in his childhood. He embraced the old man and kissed him tenderly. They were both much affected as they went into the house, where they drank tea with cream out of old china cups, and ate rich, satisfying cracknels. These trifles again reminded Kovrin of his childhood and youth. The beautiful present and the memories that were aroused in him of the past were blended together. His soul was full and rejoiced. He waited for Tanya to get up and had coffee with her, and then a walk, after which he went into his own room and sat down to work. He read with attention, made notes, only raising his eyes from time to look out of the open window, or at the fresh flowers, still wet with dew, that were in a vase on his table. And then he again lowered his eyes to his book, and it appeared to him that every nerve in his system vibrated with satisfaction. Chapter 2. A Pale Face. In the country, he continued to lead the same nervous and restless life as in town. He read and wrote very much. He learned Italian, and when he was walking he thought all the time of the pleasure he would have in sitting down to work again. Everybody was astonished how little he slept. If he happened to doze for half an hour during the day, he would afterwards not sleep all night. And after a sleepless night he felt himself active and gay, as if nothing had happened. He talked much, drank wine, and smoked expensive cigars. Often, indeed almost every day, some young girls from a neighboring estate, friends of Tanya's, came to the Pisotskys. They played on the piano and sang together. Sometimes another neighbor, a young man who played the violin very well, came too. Kovrin listened to the music and singing with avidity, and he was quite overcome by it, which was evidenced by his eyes closing and his head sinking on one side. One day after the evening tea he was sitting on the balcony reading. At that time Tanya, a soprano, one of her friends, a contralto, and the young man playing on his violin were practicing Braga's celebrated serenade. Kovrin tried to make out the words. They were Russian, and he was quite unable to understand their meaning. At last, laying his book aside and listening attentively, he understood. A girl with a diseased imagination heard one night mysterious sounds in the garden, which were so wonderfully beautiful and strange that she thought they were holy harmonies, but so incomprehensible for us mortals that they ascended again to heaven. Once more Kovrin's eyes began to close. He rose, and feeling quite exhausted he began to walk about the drawing-room and then about the dancing-hall. When they stopped singing, he took Tanya's arm and led her on to the balcony. "Ever since the morning, an old legend has been running in my head," he said. "I don't remember if I read it or whether it was told me, but the legend is a strange one and not like any other. To begin with, it's not very clear. 1,000 years ago, a certain monk, clad in black, was walking in the desert somewhere in Syria or Arabia. A few miles from the place where he was walking, some fishermen saw another black monk moving slowly across the surface of a lake. This other monk was a mirage. Now you must forget all the laws of optics, which the legend evidently does not admit, and listen to the continuation. From the mirage, another mirage was obtained, and from that one a third, so that the image of the black monk was reproduced without end in one sphere of the atmosphere after another. He was seen sometimes in Africa, sometimes in Spain, sometimes in India, then again in the far north. At last he went beyond the bounds of the earth's atmosphere, and is now wandering over the whole universe, always unable to enter into the conditions where he would be able to disappear. Perhaps at present he may be seen somewhere on Mars or on some star of the Southern Cross. But, my dear, the main point, the very essence of the whole legend, consists in this, that exactly 1,000 years from the time the monk was walking in the desert, the mirage will again be present in the atmosphere of the world, and it will show itself to men. It appears that those 1,000 years are nearly accomplished. Accordingly to the legend, we can expect the black monk either today or tomorrow. A strange mirage, Tanya said. She did not like the legend. But the strangest thing is that I can't remember from where this legend has got into my head, Kovrin said, laughing. Have I read it? Was it told me? Or perhaps I have dreamed about the black monk. By God, I can't remember, but the legend interests me. I think of it all day long. Allowing Tanya to return to her guests, he left the house, and plunged in meditation. He passed along the flower-beds. The sun was already setting. The flowers, perhaps because they had just been watered, exhaled a moist, irritating odor. In the house they had again begun to sing, and at that distance the fiddle sounded like a human voice. Kovrin, straining his memory to remember where he had heard or read the legend, bent his steps towards the park, walking slowly, and imperceptibly he arrived at the river. Running down the steep footpath that passed by the bare roots, he came to the water, disturbing some snipe and frightening a pair of ducks. Some of the tops of the gloomy pines were still illuminated by the rays of the setting sun, but on the surface of the river evening had already settled down. Kovrin crossed the footbridge to the other bank. Before him lay a wide field of young rye, not yet in flower. Neither a human habitation nor a living soul was to be seen near or far, and it seemed as if this footpath, if only you went far enough along it, would lead to that unknown, mysterious place into which the sun had just descended, and where the glorious blaze of the evening brightness was still widespread. What space! What freedom! What quiet is here! Kovrin thought as he went along the footpath. It seemed as if the whole world was looking at me, dissembling and waiting, that I should understand it. But just then waves passed over the rye, and a light wind touched his bare head. A minute later there was again a gust of wind, but a stronger one. The rye began to rustle, and behind it the dull murmur of the pines was heard. Kovrin stopped in amazement. On the horizon, something like a whirlwind or a waterspout, a high black column stretched from the earth to the sky. Its outlines were indistinct. From the first minute it was evident that it did not remain on one spot, but was moving with terrible rapidity, moving straight towards Kovrin. And the nearer it came, the smaller and clearer it became. Kovrin rushed to one side into the rye to make room for it, and he had scarcely time to do so. A monk, clad in black, with a grey head and black eyebrows, his arms crossed on his breast, was borne past him. His bare feet did not touch the earth. He had already passed Kovrin for a distance of about 12 feet when he looked back at him, nodded his head, and smiled affably, but at the same time cunningly. What a pale, a terribly pale and thin face! Again beginning to grow larger, he flew across the river, struck noiselessly against the clay bank and the pines, and, passing through them, disappeared like smoke. "Well, you see," Kovrin mumbled. "So the legend is true." Without trying to explain to himself this strange apparition, but feeling pleased that he had chanced to be so close, and had seen so distinctly not only the black garb, but even the monk's face and eyes, he returned home in pleasant agitation. In the park and the gardens people were quietly moving about. In the house they were playing. That meant he alone had seen the monk. He was very anxious to tell Tanya and Igor Semyonich all he had seen, but he thought that they would certainly consider his words mere nonsense, and it would frighten them. It was best to remain silent. He laughed loudly. He sang and danced the mazurka. He was gay, and everybody, the guests and Tanya, thought that his face had never looked so radiant and inspired, and that he certainly was a most interesting man. Chapter 3. She Loves. After supper, when their guests had departed, he went to his room and lay down on the sofa. He wanted to think about the monk. But a minute later Tanya entered the room. "Here, Andrusha, are some of Father's articles. Read them," she said, giving him a parcel of pamphlets and proofs. "They are splendid articles. He writes very well." "Well, indeed," said Igor Semyonich with a forced laugh, following her into the room. He was confused. "Don't listen to her, please, and don't read them. However, if you want to go to sleep, you may as well read them. They are excellent soporifics." "I think them excellent articles," Tanya said with deep conviction. "Read them, Andrusha, and persuade Papa to write oftener. He might write a whole course of horticulture." Igor Semyonich forced a laugh, blushed, and began to say such phrases as confused authors are wont to say. At last he gave in. "If you must, then first read this article by Gaucher and these Russian notices," he murmured, turning the pamphlets over with trembling hands. "Or else you won't understand it. Before reading my refutation, you must know what I refute. However, it's all nonsense, and very dull. Besides, I should say it's time to go to bed." Tanya left the room. Igor Semyonich sat down on the sofa next to Kovrin and sighed deeply. "Yes, my dear fellow," he began after a short silence. "So it is, my most amiable Master of Arts. Here are my writing articles. Taking part in exhibitions, receiving medals. People say Pesotsky has apples the size of a man's head. People say Pesotsky has made a fortune by his orchards and gardens. In a word, Kochubey is rich and famous. Query, to what does all this lead? The garden is really beautiful, a model garden. It is not simply a garden, it is an institution, possessing great importance for the empire because it is, so to speak, a step in a new era of Russian economy, of Russian industry. But what for? For what object? The business speaks for itself. That is not what I mean. I ask, what will become of the gardens when I die? In the condition you see it now, it will not exist for a single month without me. The whole secret of its success is not because the garden is large and there are many labourers, but because I love the work. You understand? I love it. Perhaps more than my own self. Look at me. I do everything myself. I work from morning to night. I do all the grafting myself. I do all the pruning myself, all the planting, everything. When I am assisted, I am jealous and irritable to rudeness. The whole secret lies in love, that is, in the vigilant master's eye, in the master's hand, too, in the feeling that when you go anywhere to pay a visit of an hour, you sit there and your heart is not easy. You're not quite yourself. You're afraid something may happen in the garden. When I die, who will look after it all? Who will work? A gardener? Workman? Yes, I tell you, my good friend, the chief enemy in our business is not the hare, not the cockchafer, not the frost, but the stranger. But Tanya? Kovrin asked, laughing. She can't be more injurious than the hare. She loves and understands the business. Yes, she loves and understands it. If after my death she gets the garden and becomes the mistress, I could wish for nothing better. But if, God forbid it, she should get married— Igor Semyonitch whispered and looked at Kovrin with alarm. That's just what I fear. She gets married, children arrive, and then there's no time to think of the garden. What I chiefly fear is that she'll get married to some young fellow who'll be stingy and will let the garden to some tradesman, and the whole place will go to the devil in the first year. In our business, women are the scourge of God. Igor Semyonitch sighed and was silent for a few moments. Perhaps it is egoism, but to speak frankly, I don't want Tanya to marry. I'm afraid. There's a young fop with a fiddle who comes here and scrapes at it. I know very well Tanya will not marry him. I know it very well, but I can't bear him. In general, dear boy, I'm a great oddity. I confess it. Igor Semyonitch rose and paced about the room for some time, much agitated. It was evident that he wanted to say something very important, but couldn't make up his mind to do so. I love you very much, and will speak to you quite frankly, he said at last, and thrust his hands into his pockets. There are certain ticklish subjects I regard quite simply, and I say quite openly what I think of them. I cannot bear so-called hidden thoughts. I say to you plainly, you are the only man I would not be afraid to give my daughter to. You are a clever man, you have a good heart, and you would not allow my cherished work to perish. But the chief reason is, I love you as if you were my son, and I am proud of you. If you and Tanya could settle a little romance between yourselves, why, what then? I would be very glad, very happy. As an honest man, I say this quite openly, without mincing matters. Kovrin laughed. Igor Semyonitch opened the door to leave the room, but he stopped on the threshold. If a son were to be born to you and Tanya, I'd make a gardener of him, he said reflectively. However, these are empty thoughts. Sleep well. Left alone, Kovrin lay down more comfortably on the sofa and began to look through the articles. One was entitled, "Of Intermediate Culture." Another was called, "A Few Words Concerning Mr. Z's Remarks on the Digging Up of Ground for a New Garden." A third was, "More about the Budding of Dormant Eyes." They were all of a similar nature. But what an uneasy, uneven tone! What nervous, almost unhealthy passion! Here was an article one would suppose of the most peaceful nature, and on the most indifferent subject. It was about the Russian Antonov apple. However, Igor Semyonich began with Audiatur altera pars, and finished Sapiente sat, and between these two quotations there was quite a fountain of various poisonous words addressed to the learned ignorance of our qualified gardeners who observe nature from the height of their cathedrals, or else Monsieur Gaucher, whose success has been created by the unlearned and the dilettante. Here again, quite out of place, was an insincere regret that it was now no longer possible to flog the peasants who stole fruit and broke the trees. The work is pretty, charming, healthy, but even here are passions and war, Kovrin thought. It must be that everywhere and in all arenas of human activity, intellectual people are nervous and remarkable for their heightened sensitiveness. Apparently this is necessary. He thought of Tanya, who was so delighted with her father's articles. She was small, pale, and so thin that her collarbones were visible. She had dark, wide-open, clever eyes that were always looking into something, searching for something. Her gait was short-stepped and hurried like her father's. She spoke much. She liked to argue. And then even the most unimportant phrase was accompanied by expressive looks and gestures. She certainly was nervous to the highest degree. Kovrin continued to read, but he could understand nothing. So he threw the book away. The same pleasant excitement he had felt when he danced the mazurka and listened to the music now overcame him again and aroused in him numberless thoughts. He rose and began to walk about the room, thinking of the black monk. It entered his head that if he alone had seen this strange, supernatural monk, it must be because he was ill, and had hallucinations. This reflection alarmed him, but not for long. "But I feel very well, and I do nobody any harm, therefore there is nothing bad in my hallucinations," he thought, and he again felt quite contented. He sat down on the sofa and seized his head in both hands, trying to restrain the incomprehensible joy that filled his whole being. Then he went to the table and began to work. But the thoughts he read in the books didn't satisfy him. He wanted something gigantic, immense, astounding. Towards morning he undressed and reluctantly lay down in bed. He ought to sleep. When he heard Igor Semyonich's footsteps going down to the garden, Kovrin rang the bell and ordered the manservant to bring him some wine. He drank several glasses of Chateau Lafite with pleasure, and then covered himself up to the head. His senses became dim, and he went to sleep. Chapter 4. Tears of Tanya. Igor Semyonich and Tanya often quarrelled and said unpleasant things to each other. One morning they had a quarrel. Tanya began to cry and went to her room. She didn't appear at dinner nor at tea. At first Igor Semyonich went about looking very important and sulky, as if he wished everybody to know that for him the interests of justice and order stood above everything in the world. But soon he was unable to maintain that character and became depressed. He wandered sadly about the park and constantly sighed, "Oh, good God, good God!" At dinner he would not eat a crumb. At last, feeling guilty and having qualms of conscience, he knocked at his daughter's locked door and called to her timidly, "Tanya, Tanya." and in answer he heard on the other side of the door a weak voice, exhausted with crying, but still very positive, reply, "Leave me alone, I beg you." The master's trouble affected the whole house. Even the people working in the garden were under its influence. Kovrin was immersed in his own interesting work, but at last he too became sad and felt awkward. In order in some measure to dissipate the general gloomy mood, he decided to intervene, and early in the evening he knocked at Tanya's door. He was admitted. Oh, what a shame!" he began jokingly, looking with astonishment at Tanya's tear-stained, sad little face that was all covered with red blotches. "Is it possible it's so serious? Oh! If you only knew how he tortures me," she said, and tears, bitter, plentiful tears, welled up in her large eyes. "He has worn me quite out," she continued, wringing her hands. "I said nothing to him, nothing at all. I only said there is no need to keep extra workmen if it is possible to get day labourers whenever they are wanted. Why, the workmen have been doing nothing for a whole week. I only said this, and he shouted at me, and he told me many offensive, many deeply insulting things. Why? Enough, Kovrin said as he arranged a lock of her hair. You have abused each other, you have wept, and that's enough. One mustn't be angry for long, that's wrong, all the more because he loves you, tenderly. He has spoiled my whole life," Tanya continued. "I am only insulted and wounded here. He considers me superfluous in his house. What am I to do? He's right. I'll go away from here tomorrow and become a telegraph girl. Let him—" Well, Tanya, don't cry. You mustn't, my dear. You are both hot-headed, irritable, and you are both in fault. Come along, I'll make peace between you." Kovrin spoke affectionately and persuasively, but she continued to cry, her shoulders shaking and her hands clenched as if a terrible misfortune had befallen her. He was all the more sorry for her because her grief was not serious, yet she suffered deeply. What trifles were sufficient to make this poor creature unhappy for a whole day, yes, perhaps even for her whole life? While comforting Tanya, Kovrin thought that besides this girl and her father, he might search the whole world without being able to find any other people who loved him as one of their family. If it had not been for these two people, perhaps he, who had lost both his parents in his early childhood, would not have known to his very death what sincere affection was, nor that naive, uncritical love that only exists between very near blood relatives. And he felt that his half-diseased, overtaxed nerves were drawn towards the nerves of this weeping, shuddering girl as iron is drawn to the magnet. He could never love a healthy, strong, red-cheeked woman. But pale, fragile, unhappy Tanya attracted him. He was pleased to stroke her hair, pat her shoulders, press her hands, and wipe away her tears. At last she stopped crying. But for a long time she continued to complain about her father, and of her difficult, unbearable life in that house, begging Kovrin to enter into her position. Then she gradually began to smile, and to sigh that God had given her such a bad character, and at last she laughed aloud, called herself a fool, and ran out of the room. Shortly after, when Kovrin went into the garden, Igor Semyonich and Tanya were walking together in the avenue, eating black bread and salt. They were both hungry, as if nothing had happened. Chapter 5. Red Spots. Delighted that the part of peacemaker had been successful, Kovrin went into the park. While sitting on a bench, thinking he heard the sound of wheels and of girls' laughter, visitors had arrived. When the shades of evening had begun to settle down in the gardens, faint sounds of a violin and of voices singing reached his ear, and this reminded him of the Black Monk. Where, in what land or on what planet, was that optical incongruity now being born? He had scarcely remembered the legend, and recalled to his memory the dark vision he had seen in the rye-field, when just before him a middle-sized man with a bare grey head and bare feet, who looked like a beggar, came silently out of the pine wood, walking with small, unheard steps. On his pale, death-like face, the black eyebrows stood out sharply. Nodding affably, this beggar, or pilgrim, came noiselessly and sat down on the bench. Kovrin recognized in him the Black Monk. For a minute they looked at each other, Kovrin with astonishment, the monk in a kindly and, as on the previous occasion, in a somewhat cunning manner, and with a self-complacent expression. "But you are a mirage!" Kovrin exclaimed. "Why are you here and sitting in one place, too? That is not in accordance with the legend." "That's all the same," the monk replied after a pause, in a low, quiet voice, turning his face towards Kovrin. "The mirage, the legend, and I are all the products of your excited imagination. I am a phantom." "Then you don't exist?" Kovrin asked. "Think what you like," the monk answered with a faint smile. "I exist in your imagination, and your imagination is part of nature. Consequently, I exist in nature, too." "You have a very old, clever, and expressive face, just as if you had really existed for more than 1,000 years," Kovrin said. "I didn't know that my imagination was capable of creating such phenomena. But why are you looking at me with such rapture? Do I please you?" "Yes. You are one of the few who are justly called the chosen of God. You serve the eternal truth. Your thoughts, your intentions, your extraordinary science, and your whole life bear the godlike, the heavenly stamp, as they are devoted to the reasonable and the beautiful, that is to say, to that which is eternal." "You said the eternal truth. But can people attain to the eternal truth, and is it necessary for them if there is no eternal life?" "There is eternal life," the monk answered. "Do you believe in the immortality of man?" "Yes, of course. A great, brilliant future awaits you men. And the more men like you there are on earth, the sooner this future will be realized. Without you, the servants of the first cause, you who live with discernment and in freedom, the human race would indeed be insignificant. Developing in a natural way, it would long have waited for the end of its earthly history. You are leading it to the kingdom of eternal truth several thousand years sooner, and in this lies your great service. You incarnate in yourselves the blessing with which God has honored mankind." "But what is the object of eternal life?" Kovrin asked. "The same as of all life: enjoyment. true enjoyment is knowledge, and eternal life offers numberless and inexhaustible sources of knowledge. This is the meaning of, "In my Father's house are many mansions." "If you only knew how pleasant it is to listen to you," Kovrin said, rubbing his hands with satisfaction. "I'm very pleased. But I know that when you go away I will be troubled about your reality. You are a vision, a hallucination. Consequently, I am physically ill. I am not normal." "And what of that? Why are you troubled? You are ill because you have worked beyond your strength and you are exhausted, which means that you have sacrificed your health to an idea. And the time is near when you will sacrifice your life to it, too. What could be better? It is the object to which all noble natures, gifted from above, constantly aspire." "If I know that I am mentally diseased, can I believe in myself?" "How do you know that the men of genius who are believed in by the whole world have not also seen visions? Scholars say now that genius is allied to insanity. My friend, only the ordinary people, the herd, are quite well and normal. All this consideration about the nervous century, overwork, degeneration, etc., can only seriously alarm those whose object in life is the present. That is, the people of the herd. The Romans said, 'Mens sana in corpore sano.' Not all that the Romans and Greeks said is true. Overstrain, excitement, ecstasy, all that distinguishes the prophets, the poets, the martyrs for ideas from ordinary people is opposed to the animal side of man's nature, that is, to his physical health. I repeat, if you wish to be healthy and normal, go to the herd." "It's strange you say what often comes into my mind," Kovrin said. "You appear to have looked into my soul and listened to my most secret thoughts. But let's not speak of me. What do you mean by the eternal truth?" The monk did not reply. Kovrin glanced at him and could not distinguish his face. The features became misty and melted away. The monk's head and hands gradually disappeared. His body seemed to be blended with the bench and with the evening twilight. And then he vanished entirely. "The hallucination is over," Kovrin said, and he laughed. "What a pity!" He returned towards the house, gay and happy. What little the black monk had said to him flattered not only his self-love, but his whole soul, his whole being. To be one of the chosen, to serve the eternal truth, to stand in the ranks of those who will render mankind worthy of the kingdom of God a few thousand years sooner than it would otherwise have been. That is, will save mankind from an extra 1,000 years of struggle, sin and suffering, to sacrifice everything, youth, strength, health, to the idea, to be ready to die for the general good. What a high, what a happy fate! His clean, chaste life, so full of work, passed through his memory. He remembered what he himself had learned, what he had taught others, and he arrived at the conclusion that there was no exaggeration in the words the monk had spoken. Tanya came to meet him through the park. She was dressed in another frock. "Here you are at last," she said. "We are looking for you everywhere, but what has happened to you? she said with astonishment, gazing at his enraptured, beaming countenance and his eyes that were brimming over with tears. "How strange you look, Andryusha." "I am satisfied, Tanya," Kovrin said, putting his hands on her shoulders. "I am more than satisfied. I am happy. Tanya, dear Tanya, you are a most congenial creature. Dear Tanya, I am so glad, so glad." He kissed both her hands passionately, and continued, "I have just passed through bright, beautiful, unearthly moments, but I cannot tell you all because you would call me mad, or you would not believe me. Let us talk of you, dear, charming Tanya. I love you, and I have become used to love you. Your nearness, our meetings, 10 times daily, have become a necessity for my soul. I don't know how I shall be able to exist without you when I go home." "Well," and Tanya laughed, "you will forget us in 2 days. We are little people, and you are a great man." "No, let us talk seriously," he said. "I will take you with me. Yes? Won't you come with me? You want to be mine?" "Well, well," Tanya said, and again she wanted to laugh, but laughter would not come, and red spots came out on her face. She began to breathe fast, and she walked on very quickly, not towards the house, but deeper into the park. "I never thought of this. Never," she said, clasping her hands as if in despair. Kovrin followed her and continued to speak with the same brilliant, excited face. "I want love that would conquer me entirely, and that love, Tanya, you alone can give me. I am happy, happy." She was stupefied. She bent, she shriveled, she seemed suddenly to grow 10 years older, and he thought her beautiful, and he expressed his thoughts aloud. "How beautiful she is!" Chapter 6. The Black Guest. When Igor Semyonitch heard from Kovrin that the romance had not only begun, but that there was to be a wedding, he walked about the rooms for a long time trying to hide his agitation. His hands began to tremble. His neck seemed to grow thicker and became purple. He ordered his racing droshky to be brought up and drove off somewhere. Tanya, seeing how he whipped the horse and how low down, almost over his ears, he had pressed his cap, understood his mood, shut herself up in her room, and cried all day. The peaches and plums were already ripening in the hothouses. The packing and sending off to Moscow of these delicate and tender goods required much attention, trouble, and work. Owing to the summer having been very hot and dry, it was necessary to water every tree. This took up much time and labor. Besides, multitudes of caterpillars appeared on the trees, which the workpeople, as well as Igor Semyonitch and Tanya, crushed with their fingers, to Kovrin's great disgust. Besides all this work, it was necessary to accept orders for fruit and trees for the autumn deliveries, and to carry on a large correspondence. While at the busiest time, when it seemed that nobody had a moment to spare, the season for field work came on and took away more than half the hands from the garden. Igor Semyonitch, very much sunburnt, exhausted and irritated, rushed about, now in the gardens, now in the fields, crying that he was torn to pieces, and that he would send a bullet through his head. There was also the bustle caused by the preparation of the trousseau, on which the Pesotskys set great store. Everybody in the house was made quite dizzy by the click of scissors, the noise of sewing machines, the fumes of hot irons, and the caprices of the milliner, a nervous lady who was easily offended. And, as if on purpose, every day saw the arrival of guests, who had to be entertained and fed, and who often even stayed the night. However, all this drudgery passed by almost unperceived, as if in a mist. Tanya felt that love and happiness had come upon her unawares, although for some reason, from the age of 14, she had been convinced that Kovrin would be sure to marry her. She was amazed. She was perplexed. She could not believe it herself. At times she was suddenly overpowered by such joy that she wanted to fly above the clouds and pray to God there. At others, equally suddenly, she would remember that in August she would have to take leave of her paternal home and her father. Or, God knows from where the thought would come, that she was insignificant, small and unworthy of such a great man as Kovrin. Then she went to her own room, locked herself in, and wept bitterly during several hours. When they had company, it would suddenly appear to her that Kovrin was uncommonly handsome, and that all the women were in love with him and were envious of her. Then her soul was filled with pride and delight, as if she had conquered the whole world. But he had only to smile affably at one of the girls to cause her to tremble with jealousy and retire to her own room. Then there were tears again. These new sensations quite took possession of her. She helped her father mechanically, and never noticed the peaches, nor the caterpillars, nor the labourers, nor even how quickly the time flew. Much the same happened to Igor Semyonitch. He worked from morning to night. He was always hurrying somewhere. He constantly lost his temper. He was irritable, but all this took place in a sort of enchanted state of semi-sleep. It was as if there were two men in him. One was the real Igor Semyonitch, who, listening to his gardener, Ivan Karlitch, making his report about the disorders in the gardens, would be indignant and put his hands to his head in despair. And the other, not the real one, who, as if in a half-tipsy state, would suddenly break into the business report in the middle of a word, and placing his hand on the gardener's shoulder would begin to murmur, "Whatever one may say, there is much in blood. His mother was a wonderful, a most noble, a most clever woman. It was a delight to look at her good, bright, pure face, like an angel's. She painted beautifully, she wrote verses, she could speak 5 foreign languages. She sang. Poor thing, may the heavenly kingdom be hers. She died of consumption." The unreal Igor Semyonitch sighed, and after a pause continued. "When he was a boy growing up in my house, he had the same angelic, bright and good face. He has the same look, the same movements, and the same soft, elegant manner of speaking that his mother had. And his intellect. He always astonished us by his intellect. By the way, it's not for nothing that he is a master of arts. Oh, not for nothing. But wait a little, Ivan Karlitch. You'll see what he'll be in 10 years. He'll be quite unapproachable." But here the real Igor Semyonitch, checking himself, made a serious face, caught hold of his head, and shouted, "Devils! They've dirtied, destroyed, devastated everything. The garden is lost. The garden is ruined." Kovrin worked with the same zeal as before, and did not notice the hurly-burly around him. Love only added oil to the fire. After each meeting with Tanya he returned to his room happy, enraptured, and with the same passion with which he had just kissed Tanya and had told her of his love, he seized a book, or set to work at his manuscript. All that the black monk had said about the chosen of God, eternal truth, the brilliant future of the human race, etc., only gave his work a special and uncommon meaning, and filled his soul with pride and the consciousness of his own eminence. Once or twice a week, either in the park or in the house, he met the black monk, and conversed with him for a long time. But this did not frighten him. On the contrary, it delighted him, as he was firmly convinced that such an apparition only visited the chosen, the eminent people, who had devoted themselves to the service of the idea. One day the monk appeared during dinner, and sat down in the dining-room near the window. Kovrin was delighted, and he very adroitly turned the conversation with Igor Semyonitch and Tanya upon subjects that might interest the monk. The black guest listened, and nodded his head affably. Igor Semyonitch and Tanya also listened, and smiled gaily, never suspecting that Kovrin was not talking to them, but to his vision. Unperceived, the fast of the Assumption was there, and soon after it the wedding day arrived. The marriage was celebrated according to Igor Semyonitch's persistent desire, with racket, that is, with senseless festivities that lasted 2 days. They ate and drank far more than 3,000 roubles. But owing to the bad hired band, the shrill toasts, the hurrying to and fro of the lackeys, the noise and the overcrowding, nobody could appreciate the bouquet of the expensive wines, nor the taste of the wonderful delicacies that had been ordered from Moscow. Chapter 7. Don't be afraid. It happened on one of the long winter nights that Kovrin was lying in bed reading a French novel. Poor little Tanya, who was not yet accustomed to live in a town, had a bad headache, as she often had by the evening, and was long since asleep, but from time to time she was uttering disconnected phrases in her sleep. It had struck 3. Kovrin blew out his candle and lay down. He lay long with closed eyes, but could not get to sleep because, so it seemed to him, it was very hot in the bedroom and Tanya was talking in her sleep. At 4:30 he again lit the candle, and at that moment he saw the black monk sitting on the armchair that stood near the bed. "How do you do?" the monk said, and after a short pause he asked, "Of what are you thinking now?" "Of fame," Kovrin answered. "In the French novel I have just been reading, there is a man, a young scientist, who did stupid things, and who pined away from longing for fame. These longings are incomprehensible to me, because you are wise. You look upon fame with indifference, like a plaything that does not interest you. Yes, that is true. Fame has no attraction for you. What is there flattering, interesting, or instructive in the fact that your name will be carved on your gravestone, and then time will efface this inscription together with its gilding? Besides, happily you are too many for man's weak memory to be able to remember all your names." "Naturally," Kovrin agreed. "Why should they be remembered? But let us speak of something else, for example, of happiness. What is happiness?" When the clock struck 5, he was sitting on his bed, with his feet resting on the rug, and turning to the monk, he was saying, "In ancient times one happy man was at last frightened at his own happiness. It was so great, and in order to propitiate the gods he sacrificed to them his most precious ring. You know that story? Like Polycrates, I am beginning to be alarmed at my own happiness. It appears to me strange that from morning to night I only experience joy. I am filled with joy, and it smothers all other feelings. I don't know what sadness, grief, or dullness is. Here am I, not asleep. I suffer from sleeplessness, but I am not dull. Quite seriously, I am beginning to be perplexed." "Why?" the monk asked in astonishment. "Is joy a superhuman feeling? Ought it not to be the normal condition of man? The higher a man is in his intellectual and moral development, the more free he is, the greater are the pleasures that life offers him. Socrates, Diogenes, and Marcus Aurelius knew joy, and not grief. The apostle says, 'Rejoice always.' Therefore rejoice, and be happy." "What if suddenly the gods were angered?" Kovrin said jokingly, and he laughed. What if they take from me my comfort and make me suffer cold and hunger? It will scarcely be to my taste." In the meantime, Tanya awoke, and looked at her husband with amazement and terror. He was talking, addressing himself to the armchair, gesticulating and laughing. His eyes glistened, and there was something strange in his laughter. "Andryusha, with whom are you talking?" she asked, catching hold of the hand he was stretching out to the monk. "Andryusha, with whom? Eh? With whom?" Kovrin became confused. "With him. There he sits," he answered, pointing to the black monk. "There's nobody here. Nobody. Andryusha, you're ill." Tanya put her arms round her husband and pressed close to him, and, as if to protect him from visions, she put her hand over his eyes. "You are ill," she sobbed, and her whole body trembled. "Forgive me, darling, my dear one. I have long noticed that your soul is troubled about something. You are mentally ill, Andryusha." Her shivering fit was communicated to him. He looked again at the armchair, which was now empty. He suddenly felt a weakness in the arms and legs. He was alarmed, and began to dress. "It's nothing, Tanya, nothing," he mumbled, shivering. "I really feel a little out of sorts. It's time to admit it." "I have long noticed it, and Papa has noticed it too," she said, trying to restrain her sobs. "You talk to yourself. You smile in a strange way. You don't sleep. Oh, my God, save us," she said in terror. "But you mustn't be afraid, Andryusha. Don't be afraid. For God's sake, don't be afraid." She also began to dress. Only now, when he looked at her, Kovrin understood all the danger of his position. He understood what the black monk and his talks with him meant. It was now quite clear to him that he was a madman. They both dressed, without knowing why, and went into the drawing-room. She went first. He followed her. Here Igor Semyonitch, who was staying with him, was already standing in his dressing-gown with a candle in his hand. "Don't be afraid, Andryusha," Tanya said again, trembling like one with a fever. "Don't be afraid. Papa, it will soon pass. It will soon pass." Kovrin was too excited to be able to speak. He wanted to say to his father-in-law, in a playful tone, "Congratulate me. I think I'm out of my mind." But his lips only moved, and he smiled bitterly. At 9 o'clock in the morning he was wrapped up in a fur coat and a shawl and driven in a carriage to the doctor's. He began a cure. Chapter 8. Torture. Summer had come back again, and the doctor ordered Kovrin to go to the country. Kovrin was already cured. He had ceased seeing the black monk, and it only was necessary to restore his physical strength. While living on his father-in-law's estate, he drank much milk, he worked only 2 hours a day, he did not drink wine, nor did he smoke. On the eve of St. Elias's Day, vespers were celebrated in the house. When the deacon handed the censer to the priest, there was an odour of the churchyard in the whole of the huge old hall, and it made Kovrin feel dull. He went into the garden. He walked about there without noticing the magnificent flowers. He sat on one of the benches and then wandered into the park. When he came to the river, he went down to the water's edge and stood there for some time, plunged in thought, looking at the water. The gloomy pines, with their rough roots that but a year ago had seen him so young, joyful, and hale, now did not whisper together, but stood motionless and dumb, just as if they didn't recognize him. And really, he was changed since last year. His head was closely cropped, His long, beautiful hair was gone. His gait was languid. His face had grown stouter and paler. He crossed over the footbridge to the other bank. Where the year before there had been rye, now mowed down oats lay in long rows. The sun had already disappeared, and on the horizon the red glow of sunset was still widespread, foretelling wind for the next day. It was quiet. Looking in the direction where a year before the black monk had made his first appearance, Kovrin stood for about 20 minutes, till the brightness of the sunset had faded away. When he returned to the house, languid and dissatisfied, vespers were over. Igor Semyonitch and Tanya were sitting on the steps of the terrace drinking tea. They were talking about something, but when they saw Kovrin coming they suddenly were silent, and he concluded, judging by their faces, that the conversation had been about him. "I think it's time for you to have your milk," Tanya said to her husband. "No, it's not time," he answered as he sat down on the very lowest step. "Drink it yourself, I don't want it." Tanya exchanged an anxious glance with her father and said in a guilty tone, "You yourself have noticed that milk does you good." "Oh, yes, very much good," Kovrin said, smiling. "I congratulate you. Since Friday I have added another pound to my weight." He squeezed his head tightly between his hands and said sadly, Why do you make me have this cure? All sorts of bromate preparations, idleness, warm baths, watching, poor-spirited, alarm for every mouthful, for every step, all this, in the end, will make a perfect idiot of me. I went mad. I had the mania of greatness. But for all that I was gay, healthy, and even happy. I was interesting and original. Now I have become more sober-minded and matter-of-fact. But in consequence I am now like everybody else. I am mediocre. Life is tiresome to me. Oh, how cruelly you have acted towards me. I saw hallucinations. In what way did that interfere with anybody? I ask you, with whom did that interfere? God knows what you are saying, Igor Semyonitch said with a sigh. It's tiresome to listen to you. Then don't listen. The presence of people, especially of Igor Semyonitch, irritated Kovrin. He answered him dryly, coldly, even rudely, and when he looked at him it was always with derision and with hatred. Igor Semyonitch was confused and coughed guiltily, although he could feel no blame. Unable to understand this sudden and sharp change in their friendly and kind-hearted relations, Tanya pressed close to her father and looked into his eyes with troubled glances. She wanted to understand the cause, but could not. All that was clear to her was that their relations became, with every day, worse and worse. That lately her father had aged very much, and that her husband had become irritable, capricious, quarrelsome, and uninteresting. She could no longer laugh and sing. She ate nothing at dinner. She often had sleepless nights, expecting something dreadful, and she was so worn out that once she lay in a faint from dinner-time until evening. During vespers it had appeared to her that her father was crying, and now, when they were all three sitting together on the terrace, she had to make an effort not to think of this. How happy were Buddha, Mohammed, and Shakespeare that their kind relations and doctors did not try to cure them of their ecstasies and inspirations, Kovrin said. If Mohammed had taken bromide to calm his nerves, had worked only 2 hours a day, and had drunk milk, as little would have remained of this remarkable man as of his dog. The doctors and the kind relations will in the end so blunt the capacities of mankind that at last mediocrity will be considered genius and civilization will perish. If you only knew how thankful I am to you," Kovrin said with vexation. He felt greatly irritated, and to prevent himself from saying too much, he rose quickly and went into the house. The night was calm, and the scent of tobacco and jalap was borne through the open window. In the large dark ballroom the moonlight lay in green patches on the floor and on the piano. Kovrin remembered his raptures of the previous summer, when the jalap smelled in the same way and the moon looked in at the windows. In order to renew last year's frame of mind, he hurried into his study, lit a strong cigar, and ordered the butler to bring him some wine. But the cigar only left an unpleasantly bitter taste in his mouth, and the wine had not the same flavour it had had the year before. What loss of habit does. He got giddy from the cigar, and after 2 sips of wine he had palpitations of the heart, so he had to take a dose of bromide. When she was going to bed, Tanya said to him, "My father adores you. You are angry with him for some reason, and it is killing him. Only look at him. He is aging not by days, but by hours. I implore you, Andryusha, for God's sake, for the sake of your late father, for the sake of my peace, be more affectionate with him." "I can't, and I won't." "But why?" Tanya asked, beginning to tremble all over. "Tell me why." "Because I don't like him, that's all," Kovrin said carelessly, and shrugged his shoulders. "But let us not talk of him. He is your father." I really can't understand," Tanya said, pressing her hands to her temples and looking at a point in front of her. "Something incomprehensible, something terrible is happening in our house. You are changed. You are not like yourself. You are clever. You are no ordinary man, and you get irritated with trifles. You meddle in all sort of tittle-tattle. Such trifles agitate you that sometimes one is astonished and cannot believe it, and asks oneself, is it you? Well, don't be angry. Don't be angry," she continued, alarmed by her own words and kissing his hands. "You are clever, kind, noble. You will be polite to my father. He's so good." "He's not good, but good-natured. The good-natured uncles in farces, who are somewhat like your father, well-fed and with good-natured faces, extremely hospitable and a little comical, appeared touching and amusing to me in novels and farces and also in real life at one time. Now they are repugnant to me. They are all egoists to the marrow of their bones. What's most repugnant to me is their being overfed, and their abdominal, their entirely ox-like or swine-like optimism." Tanya sat down on the bed and laid her head on the pillow. "This is torture," she said, and her voice showed she was quite exhausted, and that it was difficult for her to speak. "Ever since the winter, there has not been a single quiet moment. Good God! It's terrible. I suffer." "Yes, of course, I am Herod, and you and your little papa are the Egyptian infants. Oh, of course." His face appeared to Tanya to be ugly and disagreeable. Hatred and an expression of derision did not become him. For some time she had noticed there was something wanting in his face. It was as if a change had taken place in his countenance ever since the time his hair had been cut. She wanted to say something insulting to him, but at the moment she caught herself having such inimical feelings, she became alarmed and left the bedroom. Chapter 9. Blood of Kovrin. Kovrin was appointed to a professor's chair. His inaugural address was announced for the 2nd of December, and the notice of this lecture was hung up in the corridor of the university. But on the appointed day he sent a telegram to inform the provost that, owing to illness, he was unable to give the lecture. He had had a severe hemorrhage from the throat. For some time he had spat blood, but about twice a month the hemorrhage was considerable, and after these attacks he experienced great weakness and fell into a somnolent condition. This illness did not cause him any special anxiety, as he knew that his mother had lived for 10 years and even longer with exactly the same malady, and the doctors assured him that there was no danger. They advised him only to be calm, to live a regular life, and to talk as little as possible. In January he was again unable to give the lecture owing to the same cause, and in February it was already too late to begin the course, and it had to be postponed until the next year. At that time he no longer lived with Tanya, but with another woman, who was 2 years older than he was, and who looked after him as if he were a child. His frame of mind was peaceful and tranquil. He obeyed willingly, and when Varvara Nikolaevna decided to take him to the Crimea, he consented, although he had a foreboding that nothing good would come of this journey. They arrived in Sevastopol towards evening, and stayed the night at a hotel to rest before proceeding the next day to Yalta. They were both exhausted from the long journey. Varvara Nikolaevna had some tea, went to bed, and was soon sound asleep. But Kovrin remained up. An hour before leaving home he had received a letter from Tanya, and he had not been able to make up his mind to open it. It was still lying in his side pocket, and the thought of its being there agitated him unpleasantly. In the depths of his soul he now quite sincerely considered his marriage to have been a mistake. He was glad that he had definitely separated from her, and the remembrance of that woman, who at last had turned into a live, walking skeleton, and in whom all appeared to be dead with the exception of the large, clever eyes that looked steadily at you, aroused in him nothing but pity and sorrow for himself. And the handwriting on the envelope reminded him how unjust and cruel he had been 2 years ago, how he had vented his own emptiness of soul, dullness, solitude, and dissatisfaction with life on quite innocent people. This also reminded him of how one day he had torn into small pieces his dissertation, and all the articles he had written during his illness, and how he had thrown them out of the window, and the scraps of paper blown about by the wind had fluttered on to the flowers and the trees. In each line he saw strange pretensions that were founded on nothing, hair-brained passions, insolence, the mania of greatness, and this had produced on him the effect of reading a description of his own vices. But when the last copybook had been torn up, and had flown out of the window, for some reason he had suddenly become sorry and embittered, and he had gone to his wife and had told her all sorts of unpleasant things. Good God, how he had pestered her! One day, wanting to cause her pain, he had told her that her father had played an unenviable part in their romance, as he had asked him to marry her. Igor Semyonitch, who had accidentally overheard this, rushed into the room, and in his despair was unable to utter a word. He only stood there, shifting from one foot to another, and uttering a strange, lowing sound, as if he had been deprived of the power of speech. And Tanya, gazing at her father, gave a piercing shriek and fell down in a swoon. It was disgraceful. All this recurred to his memory at the sight of the familiar handwriting. Kovrin went out onto the balcony. It was a calm, warm evening, and there was a scent of the sea. The moon and lights were reflected in the beautiful bay, which was of a colour for which it was difficult to find a name. It was a delicate and soft blending of blue and green. In places the water assumed the colour of green copperas, and in other places it seemed as if the moonlight had solidified, and instead of water had filled the bay. And in general, what harmony of colour there was all around! What a peaceful, calm, and lofty enjoyment! In the floor below, just under the balcony, the window was probably open because one could distinctly hear women's voices and laughter. It was evident an evening party was going on there. Kovrin made an effort, unsealed the letter, and re-entering his room, he read. "My father has just died. I owe this to you, as you have killed him. Our garden is ruined. Strangers are now masters there. That is to say, what my poor father so feared is happening. I owe this to you, too. I hate you with my whole soul, and I hope you will soon perish. Oh, how I suffer! My soul is consumed by unbearable pain. May you be accursed. I mistook you for an extraordinary man, for a genius. I loved you, but you proved to be a madman." Kovrin could read no farther. He tore up the letter and threw it away. He was overpowered by a feeling of uneasiness that was almost like fear. Varvara Nikolaevna was sleeping behind the screen, and he could hear her breathing. From the story below, the sound of women's voices and laughter were borne to him, but he had a sort of feeling that in the whole of the hotel there was not a living soul besides himself. Because unhappy, sorrowing Tanya had cursed him in her letter, and had wished him to perish. A feeling of dread came over him, and he looked furtively at the door, as if he feared that the unknown power which in the space of some 2 years had caused such ruin in his life and in the lives of those dearest to him would enter the room and again take possession of him. By experience he knew that when his nerves were unstrung, the best remedy was work. He must sit down to the table and force himself to concentrate his mind on some special subject. He took out of his portfolio a copybook in which he had jotted down the synopsis of a small work he had thought of writing, if the weather proved to be bad in the Crimea, as it was dull to be without occupation. He sat down to the table and began to work at this synopsis, and it appeared to him that his old, peaceful, submissive, equitable frame of mind was coming back. The copybook with the synopsis aroused in him thoughts of worldly vanities. He thought how much life takes for the insignificant or very ordinary blessings that it is able to give man in exchange. For example, in order to receive before 40 an ordinary professorial chair and to expound in a languid, tiresome, heavy style very ordinary thoughts, which besides are the thoughts of other people, in a word, to attain the position of a moderately good scholar, he, Kovrin, had to study for 15 years, to work day and night, pass through serious mental disease, to survive an unsuccessful marriage and commit all sorts of follies and injustices, which it would be pleasant to forget. Kovrin realized now quite plainly that he was an ordinary mediocrity, and he was quite satisfied with this, as he considered every man must be contented with what he was. His synopsis would have been able to calm him if the white scraps of the torn-up letter that lay on the floor had not prevented him from concentrating his thoughts. He rose from the table, collected the fragments of the letter, and threw them out of the window. But a light wind was blowing from the sea, and the scraps of paper were scattered on the window-sill. He again was seized by a feeling of uneasiness that was almost like fear, and it seemed to him that in the whole of the hotel, with the exception of himself, there was not a single living soul. He went on to the balcony. The bay, as if alive, looked at him with numberless azure, dark blue, turquoise blue, and fiery eyes, and enticed him towards itself. It was really hot and sultry, and it would be pleasant to have a bath. Suddenly, in the lower story just under the balcony, there was the sound of a violin, and two delicate women's voices began to sing. They were singing something very familiar. The song that was being sung below told of a girl who had a sick imagination, who heard mysterious sounds at night in the garden, and made up her mind that they were sacred harmonies that were incomprehensible to us mortals. Kovrin had catchings of his breath, and his heart grew heavy with sadness, and a beautiful, sweet joy, such as he had long forgotten, throbbed in his breast. A high, black column that looked like a whirlwind or a waterspout appeared on the opposite shores of the bay. With terrible rapidity it moved across the bay in the direction of the hotel, becoming smaller and darker, and Kovrin had scarcely time to stand to one side to make room for it. A monk, with a bare head and black eyebrows, barefooted, with hands crossed on his breast, was borne past him and stopped in the middle of the room. "Why did you not believe me?" he asked reproachfully, and looked kindly at Kovrin. "If you had believed me then, when I told you that you were a genius, you would not have passed these 2 years so sadly and so miserably." Kovrin believed that he was the chosen of God and a genius. He instantly remembered all his former conversations with the black monk, and he wanted to speak, but blood began to flow from his throat straight onto his breast, and he, not knowing what to do, passed his hands over his chest, and his cuffs became saturated with blood. He wanted to call Varvara Nikolaevna, who was sleeping behind the screen. He made an effort and said, "Tanya." He fell on the floor, and raising himself on his arm again, called, "Tanya." He called to Tanya. He called to the great gardens with their lovely flowers sprinkled with dew. He called to the park, to the pines with their rugged roots, to the fields of rye, to his wonderful science, to his youth, courage, joy. He called to life that was so beautiful. He saw on the floor, close to his face, a large pool of blood, and from weakness he could not utter another word. But an inexpressible, a boundless happiness filled his whole being. Below, just under the balcony, they were playing the serenade, and the black monk whispered to him that he was a genius, and that he was only dying because his weak human body had lost its balance and could no longer serve as the garb for a genius. When Varvara Nikolaevna awoke and came from behind the screen, Kovrin was already dead, and his face had stiffened in a blissful smile.
This ends The Black Monk.